Quinn always suspected Dexter Morgan, but now with Batista dead and the Bay Harbor Butcher's trophies in the wind, suspicion in Miami will rise again. What if Resurrection Season 2 is the moment Quinn finally proves what he always knew? With Desmond Harrington confirmed to return as Lieutenant Quinn in Dexter Resurrection, all the pieces are falling into place for this long-awaited confrontation. Number 1. Batista's death changes everything. Season 1 ends with Batista closing in on the Bay Harbor Butcher truth, and getting killed for it. Miami Metro can't sweep this under the rug. When a former captain dies while actively investigating a decades-old serial killer case, every alarm bell in the department starts ringing. Internal affairs would be all over this within hours, demanding answers, timelines, and most importantly, suspects. Here's where Quinn's promotion to lieutenant becomes crucial. Remember, Quinn got that final phone call from Detective Wallace right before Batista was murdered. Now, as one of the few remaining detectives who worked closely with Batista during his time as captain, Quinn becomes the natural choice to lead the internal review. His new rank gives him access to files that were previously above his pay grade, including Batista's private notes and the evidence he had been quietly gathering. Angel Batista was more than just a colleague for Quinn. He was respected, trusted, and considered a mentor. Batista's death would feel personal. When you combine that emotional investment with Quinn's already suspicious nature and his history of questioning official narratives, you have a detective who won't let this go. The timing creates perfect storm conditions. Miami Metro was already paranoid after the Leon Prater situation. Now, the former captain is dead, killed while investigating the same case that supposedly ended with James Dokes taking the fall. Quinn would be asking himself, what did Batista discover that got him killed? What connections was he making that someone didn't want exposed? Quinn's institutional memory becomes a weapon here. He remembers how the Bay Harbor Butcher case was hastily closed. He remembers the convenient timing of Dokes' death. Most importantly, he remembers his own suspicions about Dexter Morgan. Suspicions that were dismissed or discouraged by the very people who are now dead. With his new authority as lieutenant, Quinn finally has the power to pursue those hunches, without asking permission. The ripple from one murder doesn't stop at the body, it hits the whole department next. And that leads me on to number 2, the missing blood slides create a perfect storm. Now here's where things get really interesting. Dexter quietly stole his old blood slide collection from Leon Prater's evidence vault during Season 1. Those slides were the cornerstone of the entire Bay Harbor Butcher investigation. Every single piece of physical evidence that tied the Butcher to his crimes was contained in that collection. Without them, the case against James Dokes starts to look incredibly shaky. Now, imagine Quinn reviewing the evidence files. He immediately notices that the slides were present during the initial Prater raid. There are photographs, catalog entries, and witness statements from the officers who discovered them. But somewhere between the raid and the final evidence cataloging, they vanished. Evidence doesn't just walk away from police custody. Somebody with access, knowledge, and serious motivation took those slides. Quinn knows how evidence rooms work. He's been a cop long enough to understand that this level of tampering requires inside knowledge. The person who stole these slides knew exactly what they were looking for, where to find them, and how to get in and out without triggering alarms. This was someone reclaiming what they considered theirs. The missing slides also destroyed the official narrative. The Bay Harbor Butcher case was closed because James Dokes was found dead with the slides in his possession. But if the slides are gone, what does that say about Dokes' guilt? Either the Miami Metro Evidence Room is so incompetent that they have lost the most important serial killer evidence in the city's history, or the real Bay Harbor Butcher came back for his trophies. Evidence doesn't just vanish, unless you forget to hit subscribe, so don't let this case file slip past you. Now, Quinn would be asking himself, who else even knew about the slides' significance? Who had the kind of detailed knowledge needed to locate them in Prater's chaotic collection? Who would be desperate enough to risk everything to get them back? The answer keeps circling back to one person, someone who was close to the original investigation, someone who understood the forensic significance of those slides, someone who's been collecting them for years. And when panic meets paperwork, the first crack always shows up in evidence. 3. Prater's security systems tell the real story. Leon Prater was paranoid about protecting his collection, which means his storage facility would be equipped with security systems that could expose exactly when and how Dexter accessed the vault. Even though Prater is dead, those security records would still exist, and Quinn would have the authority to subpoena them as part of the investigation into Batista's murder. Think about what Prater's security setup would have looked like. The guy was hoarding evidence from dozens of crime scenes over decades. He couldn't risk random break-ins or discovery by authorities. He would have had to have had cameras, motion sensors, access logs, maybe even biometric scanners. Every time somebody entered the facility, there would be timestamps, video footage, and electronic records of the breach. Quinn could piece together a timeline of when the vault was accessed before Miami Metro's official raid. The security footage would show who entered, how they knew exactly where to find the Bay Harbor Butcher slides, and how long they spent in the facility. More importantly, it would show someone who moved through Prater's chaotic collection with purpose and familiarity. Not like a random burglar, but like someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. The technical evidence gets even more damaging when Quinn cross-references the security breach timeline with other data. Cell phone tower records could show whose phone was in the area during the break-in. Traffic cameras might have captured license plates. Credit card records could reveal who purchased tools or equipment needed for the job. Financial records might show unusual cash withdrawals before the theft. But here's the most compelling piece of evidence Quinn could uncover: Prater's own research into the Bay Harbor Butcher case. If Prater was obsessive enough to steal and catalog the slides, he was probably obsessive enough to research their significance. His personal files might contain detailed notes about Dexter Morgan, timeline comparisons, newspaper clippings, and investigative theories that connect directly to the original case. When Quinn realizes that someone accessed Prater's vault with insider knowledge, knew exactly where to find specific evidence, and understood the forensic significance of what they were stealing, the suspect pool becomes very small. But there's more to it. If the slides didn't vanish on their own, something else had to have kept score. And that leads me on to number 4, Quinn's decade-long history of suspicion will finally pay off. So let's talk about Quinn's personal history with Dexter, because this goes way deeper than most people remember. Quinn has been circling the truth about Dexter Morgan for over a decade, accumulating suspicious and red flags that would make any detective's instincts scream. Now, with Batista dead and new evidence surfacing, all those buried hunches are about to become very relevant. It started after Rita's death. Quinn couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Dexter's story. The Trinity Killer angle felt convenient, almost too neat. And then there was the Kyle Butler connection. Quinn actually tracked down that sketch, the one that looked suspiciously like Dexter. He investigated those leads quietly, professionally, but he was told to back off. Sound familiar? That's the same pattern that got Batista killed, asking too many questions about Dexter Morgan. But Quinn's biggest breakthrough came through Stan Liddy, the corrupt cop he hired to tail Dexter. What most people forget is that Liddy actually filmed Dexter dumping bags into the ocean from his boat. Liddy captured footage of Dexter's ritual disposal method, the same method the Bay Harbor Butcher used for his victims. When Liddy turned up dead, Quinn knew he was onto something big, but he also knew that he was in over his head. Then there's the Maria LaGuerta situation. Quinn was there when Dexter systematically framed LaGuerta. He saw how carefully orchestrated it was, how perfectly it played out to discredit her investigation. When LaGuerta ended up dead shortly after, Quinn had to know it wasn't coincidence, but he stayed quiet, probably because he was scared or because he knew no one would believe him. The psychological toll on Quinn must have been enormous. He's been carrying those suspicions for years, watching Dexter walk free while knowing that there's something weird about him. Every time there was a suspicious death, every time evidence went missing, every time the official story felt too convenient, Quinn would be thinking about Dexter Morgan. Now, Batista's death changes everything for Quinn personally. If he feels like there's a possibility that Dexter killed Batista to protect his secret, that crosses a line that Quinn can't ignore. And for the one cop who never stopped side-eyeing Dexter, the past finally starts talking back. Next, we move on to number 5. Miami Metro becomes a powder keg of paranoia. Batista's murder creates institutional trauma that spreads throughout Miami Metro like wildfire. When cops start dying, especially former captains investigating cold cases, every officer in the department starts looking over their shoulder. The psychological impact goes far beyond normal case anxiety. This becomes about survival. Think about the conversations happening in the break rooms and parking lots. Officers would be whispering about patterns, about who else might be at risk, about whether there's a target on their backs if they dig too deep into certain cases. The Bay Harbor Butcher investigation, which was supposed to be ancient history, suddenly feels very present and very dangerous. Officers who never gave it much thought are now wondering what Batista discovered that got him killed. Internal affairs would be in full crisis mode. They can't have former captains getting murdered while investigating departmental cases. The pressure from the top would be immense. Find answers, identify threats, restore confidence in the force. Quinn, as the lieutenant leading the investigation, would be feeling the pressure intensely. His superiors would expect results, and they'd expect them fast. But here's where the paranoia works in Quinn's favor. In a normal situation, his theories about Dexter might be dismissed as far-fetched or conspiratorial. But when the department is already convinced that someone is targeting cops who ask too many questions, Quinn's suspicions suddenly seem a lot more reasonable. His colleagues would be more willing to listen to theories they previously would have ignored. The institutional memory of Miami Metro also becomes crucial here. Older officers remember the Bay Harbor Butcher case, remembering how quickly it was closed, remember the questions that were never fully answered. They remember James Dokes' reputation. He was a good cop, not the type to suddenly become a serial killer. When you combine that institutional knowledge with current fears about officer safety, you get a department that's ready to reopen old wounds. Quinn could leverage this paranoia strategically. He wouldn't need to convince his colleagues that Dexter is definitely the Bay Harbor Butcher. He just needs to convince them that the original investigation was flawed and that those flaws might have gotten Batista killed. Once the department is committed to reinvestigating, the evidence would start speaking for itself. Miami Metro isn't the only one under pressure. My channel is too, if you're not subscribed. So help me close this case properly. Meanwhile, a force that's grieving turns into a force that's looking over its shoulders, because Harrison's kill in New York creates disturbing parallels. The Harrison situation in New York potentially gives Quinn the final piece of his puzzle, though he might not realize it immediately. When word gets back to Miami Metro about a teenager using Bay Harbor Butcher's methods, dismemberment, disposal in bags, the whole ritual, every detective who's worked that original case is going to pay attention. For Quinn, this will be confirmation of his worst fears about Dexter Morgan. Here's what makes this connection so powerful from Quinn's perspective. He knows Harrison is Dexter's son. He knows Dexter has been raising this kid for years. When a teenager suddenly starts using the exact methods that made the Bay Harbor Butcher infamous, that's not something you learn from true crime podcasts or Wikipedia articles. That's specialized knowledge passed down from someone who knows those techniques intimately. Quinn would be asking himself, how does a 17-year-old know the precise dismemberment techniques used by a serial killer from 20 years ago? How does he know about the disposal methods, the bag count, the specific ritual aspects that were never fully released to the public? The only logical answer is that someone taught him, someone who was there, someone who knew these methods because they created them. The timing becomes crucial too. Harrison's kill happens after years of living with Dexter, after being raised and trained by him. If Quinn can establish that timeline, when Harrison moved in with Dexter, when his behavior might have changed, when he might have learned these techniques, it creates a compelling narrative about what's happening in that household. But Quinn would also be thinking about the psychological implications. If Dexter is the Bay Harbor Butcher and he's been training his son, what does that say about his long-term plans? Was he grooming Harrison as the successor? Was this always the endgame? The idea that Dexter might be creating the next generation of serial killers would add urgency to Quinn's investigation. The New York connection also gives Quinn potential allies outside of Miami Metro. NYPD detectives working Harrison's case might be willing to share information, especially if Quinn can convince them that there's a connection to a larger pattern. Cross-jurisdictional cooperation could bypass some of the political obstacles Quinn might face within his own department. If New York is taking the Bay Harbor Butcher connection seriously, Miami Metro would have to as well. When today's leads run thin, the answers are usually hiding where someone died looking for them, because LaGuerta's buried files become Quinn's roadmap. Maria LaGuerta died pursuing the truth about Dexter Morgan, and her private investigation files were buried with her reputation. But Batista's death changes the context completely. Suddenly, LaGuerta doesn't look like a disgraced captain chasing conspiracy theories. She looks like a victim who got too close to the truth. Quinn, with his new authority and renewed focus, could be the one to bring those files back into the light. LaGuerta was methodical in her investigation. She documented everything: timeline inconsistencies, evidence discrepancies, witness statements that didn't quite add up. She tracked Dexter's movements, cross-referenced his whereabouts with the Bay Harbor Butcher activity, and built a circumstantial case that was actually pretty compelling. The problem was that she was working alone, against institutional resilience, and she ran out of time before she could make it airtight. Quinn knows where those files are. He knows how LaGuerta worked, how she thought, what she was investigating when she died. More importantly, he knows that her death followed the same pattern as Batista's: a Miami Metro captain getting too close to the Bay Harbor Butcher truth and ending up dead. That pattern recognition would be impossible for Quinn to ignore. The beauty of LaGuerta's files is that they were created by someone with access to all the same resources Quinn now has as a lieutenant. She has clearance to pull evidence records, interview transcripts, forensic reports, and personnel files. Her investigation wasn't based on hunches or conspiracy theories. It was based on official police records and documented inconsistencies in the case file. When Quinn reviews LaGuerta's work with fresh eyes and new context, he'd probably be amazed at how thorough she was. She identified specific times when Dexter's alibis didn't match his stated whereabouts. She documented instances where evidence was mishandled or overlooked. She tracked financial records, phone logs, and travel patterns that painted a picture of someone living a double life. But LaGuerta's files also contained something that Quinn's previous investigations lacked: emotional motivation. She wasn't just solving a case, she was trying to clear James Dokes' name and restore his reputation. That personal investment drove her to dig deeper than a routine investigation would have required. Now, Quinn has that same emotional motivation, but for Angel Batista instead of Dokes. The files would also show Quinn exactly what got LaGuerta killed. He could see which leads she was pursuing in her final weeks, which evidence she was examining, which witnesses she was planning to re-interview. That information would tell Quinn not just what to investigate, but how to do it safely. He could learn from LaGuerta's mistakes while building on her discoveries. Stack the bodies, trace the questions, and a brutal arithmetic appears. However, Quinn becomes the last man standing in a deadly pattern. The mathematics are terrifying when you line them up. James Dokes questions Dexter's story and died. Maria LaGuerta investigated Dexter as the Bay Harbor Butcher and died. Angel Batista reopened the Bay Harbor Butcher case and died. Now, Joey Quinn is the last Miami Metro detective alive who ever seriously suspected Dexter Morgan. That survivor status puts him in an incredibly dangerous position, but it also gives him enormous power if he's smart about how he uses it. Quinn understands the pattern better than most detectives. He's seen how this plays out, ask questions about Dexter, dig into the Bay Harbor Butcher case, and end up dead under convenient circumstances. But Quinn also has something that his predecessor didn't. He knows the pattern exists. Dokes probably didn't see it coming. LaGuerta might have suspected it but couldn't prove it. Batista was focused on the case, not the personal danger. Quinn has the benefit of hindsight and institutional memory. The survivor's burden is psychological torture. Quinn knows that every day he delays, every day he stays quiet, another piece of evidence might disappear, or another witness might have an accident. But he also knows that moving too quickly or too obviously makes him the next name on that list. The pressure would be incredible. How do you investigate someone you suspect of killing cops when that same someone might be watching your every move? Quinn's position gives him access, but it also makes him a bigger target. As the ranking officer leading the Batista investigation, Quinn's death would be much harder to explain away. Dexter couldn't make it look like a random crime or an accident. It would clearly be connected to the case. That visibility might actually be Quinn's protection, but only if he's careful about how he proceeds. The moral weight of the situation would be crushing. Quinn isn't just investigating a case anymore. He's carrying the torch for 3 dead colleagues who died pursuing the same truth. Their deaths would fuel his determination, but they'd also serve as a constant reminder of what happens to cops who get too close to Dexter Morgan. Every decision Quinn makes carries the weight of their sacrifice. But Quinn also has something none of them had. He knows he's the last detective left. That knowledge could be liberating in a way. There's no one else to pass the responsibility to. No one else who has the institutional memory and personal investment to see this through. If Quinn doesn't expose Dexter, no one will. That realization might be exactly what finally pushes him to take the risk his predecessors couldn't survive. 3 detectives are already dead chasing Dexter. Don't be the 4th who missed the subscribe button. And while Quinn widens the net, Dexter narrows his focus exactly at the distraction that investigators pray for. Because Dexter's obsession with the files creates Quinn's perfect window. The files Dexter stole from Leon Prater's vault contain decades of collected evidence, police reports, and investigative materials that could expose him in ways that he never anticipated. Now, Dexter finds himself in a race against time, trying to identify and eliminate every potential threat buried in Prater's obsessive documentation. This preoccupation with damage control creates the perfect opportunity for Quinn to study him without being detected. Prater was methodically collecting materials from unsolved cases, cold files, and investigations that went nowhere. Those files could include witness statements that were never followed up, crime scene photos from related cases, financial records, travel logs, and communication intercepts. Dexter would need to go through everything systematically to understand what threats exist and who else might have connected the dots. But here's where Dexter's perfectionism becomes his weakness. He can't just destroy everything and hope for the best. He needs to know exactly what evidence exists and who has access to it. That means that he'll be spending time researching each potential threat, tracking down witnesses, and eliminating loose ends. Every hour he spends focused on Prater's files is an hour he's not paying attention to Quinn's investigation. Quinn, meanwhile, would notice Dexter's behavior changes. Dexter would be more distracted, more secretive, possibly making unusual requests for access to old case files or asking questions about retired officers and closed investigations. For someone who's been watching Dexter for as long as Quinn has, these behavioral shifts would be red flags worth investigating. The most dangerous part for Dexter is that Prater's files likely contain information about witnesses and contacts that Dexter doesn't even know exist. There might be people who saw something suspicious years ago but never reported it, or investigators who had theories but couldn't prove them. As Dexter works through the files, he'd realize that his secret isn't as secure as he thought, and that realization would drive him to take increasingly desperate actions. This is where Quinn's opportunity becomes critical. While Dexter is focused on historical threats, Quinn is building a contemporary case using current investigative resources. Dexter's attention is divided between past and present dangers, but Quinn can focus entirely on the evidence trail that's developing right now. The hunter becomes the hunted, but the prey doesn't realize he's being stalked, because the one threat you can't bag and tag is the one that keeps you up at night. And then there's Dexter's hunt for AI. Among all the threats buried in Prater's files, one name would stand out to Dexter as the most dangerous. The mysterious AI who's been tracking him online and seems to know details about his methods that were never made public. Finding and eliminating this digital stalker wouldn't just be about protecting his secret. It would become an obsession that could ultimately lead to his downfall. AI represents everything that Dexter fears most, an opponent who's intelligent, methodical, and potentially untouchable. This isn't someone that Dexter can intimidate, frame, or kill using his usual methods. AI exists in the digital realm, protected by anonymity and distance. To eliminate this threat, Dexter would need to venture into unfamiliar territory, cybercrime, digital forensics, and online investigation, areas where his usual skills don't apply. The hunt for AI would consume enormous amounts of Dexter's time and energy. He needs to learn new techniques, digital tracking, IP address tracing, social media investigation, and cyber surveillance. He might even need to recruit from tech-savvy allies or criminal contacts, which would create additional security risk and potential witnesses to his activities. Every step he takes to find AI would leave its own digital footprint that investigators like Quinn could potentially discover. But here's the brilliant irony. Dexter's obsession with finding AI might actually help Quinn's investigation. As Dexter digs deeper into digital evidence and online tracking, he'd be creating search histories, communication records, and behavior patterns that could be traced back to him. His attempts to hunt AI would generate exactly the kind of digital evidence that modern police investigators rely on. The psychological toll would be significant too. Dexter's entire killing methodology is based on control, preparation, and physical dominance. AI represents a threat that he can't physically confront, can't manipulate using traditional methods, and can't eliminate with certainty. This would create stress and anxiety that could affect his judgment and lead to mistakes in other areas of his life. Most dangerously for Dexter, the AI hunt might force him to reveal capabilities and knowledge that he's kept hidden. To track someone down who knows details about the Bay Harbor Butcher methods, Dexter might need to demonstrate his own intimate knowledge of those methods. Every clue he follows, every connection he makes, would potentially expose him to the same degree that he's trying to expose AI. But legacies don't stay theoretical. Eventually, somebody makes a mess that you can't mop quietly, and we're talking about Harrison's second kill. Harrison's first kill in New York was contained, clinical, almost textbook in its execution. But what happens when the psychological dam breaks completely? The next time Harrison kills, it might not be the controlled ritual that Dexter taught him. It could be messy, impulsive, and impossible to cover up. This scenario would create a crisis that brings unwanted attention to both Harrison and his connection to Dexter. Harrison losing control during a high-stress situation is something we've already seen a glimpse of. Maybe he's confronted by someone who reminded him of his trauma, or he faces a threat that he can't handle with his usual restraint. Instead of the methodical approach he learned from Dexter, Harrison might kill in a moment of rage or panic. The crime scene would be chaotic, bloody, and full of forensic evidence that couldn't be easily explained away. The messiness of this hypothetical second kill would create problems that Harrison isn't equipped to handle. He knows how to dismember and dispose of bodies, but he doesn't know how to clean crime scenes, eliminate forensic evidence, or create believable alibis. Without Dexter there to guide him through damage control, Harrison would be making decisions based on panic rather than planning. Every choice he makes would compound the mistakes. Getting caught would be almost inevitable in this scenario. A disorganized crime scene, witnesses who saw Harrison before or after the incident, security cameras that captured his movements, physical evidence left behind in his haste to escape. Any of these factors could lead to his arrest. Once in custody, Harrison would face interrogation by experienced detectives who would notice inconsistencies in his story and connections to other suspicious deaths. But here's where it gets really dangerous for Dexter. Harrison's arrest would trigger a comprehensive background investigation. Detectives would examine his living situation, his relationship with his father, his psychological history, and any previous incidents that might indicate a pattern of violent behavior. That investigation would inevitably lead back to Dexter and raise questions about what kind of environment Harrison was living in. The New York authorities would also likely share information with other jurisdictions, especially if they suspect Harrison's crime is connected to other cases. Miami Metro would be contacted about any connections to the Bay Harbor Butcher case, putting Quinn in direct communication with investigators who have Harrison in custody. This cross-jurisdictional cooperation would give Quinn access to information and evidence that he couldn't attain through Miami Metro's internal investigations alone. And when separate hunts start sharing footprints, two cities become one trap. And then there's the New York Ripper collision. The New York Ripper case represents more than just a serial killer investigation. It's the thread that could tie together every loose end in Dexter's carefully constructed false identity. If this case intersects with Harrison's situation and brings Detective Wallace back into Dexter's orbit, it could create the perfect storm that finally exposes decades of buried secrets. Detective Wallace isn't just another cop working on a serial killer case. He already demonstrated that he's willing to dig deeper than service explanations, question official narratives, and pursue leads that other investigators might dismiss. His investigation into the Ripper case has likely given him insights into serial killer psychology, forensic evidence patterns, and investigative techniques that would make him particularly dangerous to Dexter if their paths cross again. The convergence could happen in several ways. If Harrison gets arrested for his messy second kill, Wallace might be called in to consult on the case due to his expertise with the Ripper investigation. If the Ripper methods show similarities to the Bay Harbor Butcher, Wallace might reach out to Miami Metro for consultation, putting him in direct contact with Quinn. If AI's digital investigation connects to both the Ripper case and the Bay Harbor Butcher, Wallace could find themselves working the same leads that Quinn is pursuing. What makes Wallace particularly dangerous is that he's approaching these cases from the outside, without the institutional baggage and political pressures that have constrained Miami Metro investigations. He doesn't have superiors telling him to avoid certain theories or drop inconvenient leads. He's not worried about protecting the department's reputation or maintaining relationships with problematic colleagues. Wallace can pursue the truth wherever it leads, even if it leads to uncomfortable conclusions about other law enforcement agencies. The timing creates additional problems for Dexter. While he's focused on hunting AI and managing the fallout from Prater's files, he might not realize that Wallace is connecting the dots from a completely different angle. By the time Dexter recognizes Wallace as a threat, it might be too late to eliminate him without creating even more attention and suspicion. But the most dangerous aspect of Wallace's connection is that it would give Quinn an ally outside of Miami Metro. If Wallace reaches out to share information about the patterns he's noticing, or if Quinn contacts Wallace to compare notes, they could validate each other's suspicions and combine their resources. Two experienced detectives working the same case from different jurisdictions would be much harder for Dexter to monitor, manipulate, or eliminate than a single investigator working alone. So unless Dexter does what he does best and gets out of it once again scot-free, only time will tell. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe with notifications on, and I'll see you in the next video.